The origin of the quote, where did it come from? Let's begin by uncovering the origin of one of the most quoted phrases in Christian circles. God helps those who help themselves. This phrase, which we hear repeated time and again in sermons, Bible studies, and casual conversations, has a deep-rooted presence in our spiritual vocabulary. It's so widely accepted that many assume it's a direct quote from the Bible. The truth is, Jesus never said it. This concept is a misattribution that has crept into Christian culture over time, and it's crucial for us to understand where it actually comes from and why it doesn't reflect the heart of the gospel. The phrase itself originates from Benjamin Franklin, a founding father of the United States, who included it in his Poor Richard's Almanac in the 18th century. Franklin, a man of wisdom and practicality, often used this kind of saying to encourage people towards self-reliance and personal responsibility. His goal was to inspire individuals to take charge of their own lives and work hard for their success, which was a key principle during the birth of the American Republic. Franklin's intention behind this idea wasn't to preach a biblical doctrine, but rather to promote personal effort as the key to a prosperous life. When Franklin penned the words, he wasn't making a statement about the spiritual relationship between humanity and God. Instead, he was expressing the value of self-help, of pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps. At the time, it was a call for individual effort in a world that demanded hard work and perseverance. However, as these words passed through generations and across cultures, they eventually found their way into the church. And somewhere along the line, they became intertwined with Christian theology, wrongly attributed to the teachings of Jesus Christ. Now imagine how easy it is for such a quote to gain traction. In an age where people were struggling with personal and economic hardships, where society emphasized individual responsibility, it was only natural that the idea of helping yourself would resonate with many, especially when paired with the comforting notion of divine assistance. It sounded logical, it felt right, and most importantly, it seemed biblical. Yet this phrase doesn't align with the teachings of Jesus. Franklin's words were rooted in a belief in self-reliance, a virtue perhaps for building character and pursuing success in the world. But Jesus, in his ministry, never once suggested that God only helps those who are self-sufficient. On the contrary, he taught that God is near to the brokenhearted, to the lost, to the weary, and to those who cannot help themselves. Think of the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10:25, 37 through 37. A man was beaten, robbed, and left for dead on the side of the road. In his weakened state, he could do nothing for himself. A priest and a Levite passed by and ignored him, but a Samaritan, an outsider in Jewish society, stopped, bandaged his wounds, and took him to an inn to be cared for. This story highlights a radical shift from help yourself to help others. It isn't the self-reliant man who is rewarded, but the one who shows compassion and mercy regardless of the circumstances. Similarly, we see the story of the paralytic man in Mark 2:01. Mark 2:01, Mark 12. This man couldn't even help himself to the point of walking or approaching Jesus. It was through the faith of his friends that he was brought to Jesus. And what did Jesus do? He healed the man, not because he was self-sufficient, but because he had people who believed in him and helped him get to Jesus. That's the message of the gospel. We are not left alone to struggle and fight for God's help. He meets us where we are. This is the complete opposite of the God helps those who help themselves mentality. This misconception has consequences. When we begin to believe that God only helps those who are capable, we not only misrepresent God's nature, but also create a spiritual barrier that blocks us from experiencing His grace. It falsely tells us that our worthiness of God's assistance depends on how much we can do on our own. It tells us that if we can't get it all together, if we can't solve all our problems, if we're not strong enough, then maybe we don't deserve God's help. This isn't just incorrect, it's harmful. It causes people to withdraw from God and rely solely on their own strength, leaving them feeling defeated and isolated when they fail to live up to that unrealistic standard. Consider this. How many times have you faced a situation where your best efforts were simply not enough? How many of you have poured your heart into a relationship, a career, or a dream only to hit a wall? Have you ever reached a point where it felt like all the help in yourself in the world couldn't bring about the breakthrough you were desperate for? It's in these moments when we come face to face with our limitations that we are reminded that God's help does not come because we are capable, but because He is good. Think about the Israelites as they wandered in the desert. They were trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's advancing army, completely helpless. There was no way they could help themselves. But it was in that moment of despair that God parted the sea and led them to safety. Their deliverance did not come because of their ability, but because of God's faithfulness. The truth is, the Bible paints a picture of a God who helps those who can't help themselves, those who are humble enough to admit their need for Him, and those who are broken enough to realize that their strength is limited. In a world that pushes the idea of self-sufficiency and individual achievement, it's easy to slip into the mindset that God will only intervene when we've done all we can. But that's not what Scripture teaches. God's help is not based on our ability to help ourselves first. His help is rooted in His love, mercy, and grace. The idea of God helps those who help themselves appeals to our sense of pride and self-reliance. But the true gospel message is about humility, surrender, and faith. It's not about getting everything right on our own. It's about turning to God when we realize we can't do it alone. And this is where we find His grace. The phrase God helps those who help themselves is not only misleading but also spiritually dangerous. When we embrace this mentality, we unintentionally shift the focus from faith in God to self-reliance. The core issue lies in how this false idea subtly tells us that God's assistance is something we earn by being strong, capable, and independent. But let me ask you, have you ever faced a challenge in your life that was bigger than your strength? Have you ever reached a point where all your personal efforts, all your striving weren't enough to change your circumstances? We all have. Think about the times you've struggled in your marriage, in your career, or with your health. How many times did you feel the weight of the world on your shoulders? How many times did you feel as though you were standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to hold it all together with your own hands, only to realize that your best efforts weren't enough? In those moments, if we believe that God helps those who help themselves, we may feel as though we're somehow unworthy of God's intervention. This is a dangerous mindset. What this false doctrine does is build a wall between us and God. Instead of drawing closer to Him in times of struggle, we retreat into our own efforts, often frustrated by our limitations. When we try to solve everything on our own, we inadvertently block God from stepping in. The truth is, God never meant for us to face life's battles alone. When we start believing that our success in life depends solely on our ability to help ourselves, we forget that God has always been the source of our strength. He doesn't want us to struggle under the weight of our problems on our own. In the Bible, we see time and time again that God's people are not those who rely on their own strength, but those who trust in His power. David, the shepherd boy, is a perfect example. When he faced Goliath, the giant warrior, he did not approach the battle in his own strength. He didn't believe that God would only help him if he could help himself first. Instead, David declared in 1 Samuel 17:45, "You come against me with a sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." David's victory wasn't in his ability to help himself, but in his faith in God to provide the strength he needed. Self-reliance isn't a bad thing when it encourages responsibility, hard work, and perseverance. But when we elevate it above faith in God, we miss the heart of the gospel. Faith in God doesn't mean that we sit back and do nothing. It means that we recognize that we are dependent on Him for everything. Our strength comes not from our own abilities, but from God's infinite power and grace. When we believe that God only helps those who help themselves, we elevate our own efforts to a place that only God belongs. We forget that God's help is not earned. It's a gift freely given to those who are willing to receive it. This kind of self-reliance makes us spiritually prideful, thinking that we are capable of solving everything on our own, which in turn leads to spiritual exhaustion. Have you ever been so tired from trying to do everything yourself that you lost sight of God's promises? It's when we try to control everything, fix every problem, solve every issue, that we begin to miss the opportunity for God to intervene. The truth is, God calls us to trust in Him, to humble ourselves and acknowledge that we can't do everything by our own strength. In Matthew 17:20, Jesus tells His disciples, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Jesus doesn't say, if you work hard enough, you can move mountains on your own. No, He invites us to trust in His power, no matter how small or weak our faith may seem. It is faith that taps into God's supernatural ability, not self-reliance. In this light, self-reliance can quickly become a spiritual trap. When we begin to think that everything depends on us, we close ourselves off from the very help we need. And in doing so, we place ourselves under a heavy burden, one that God never intended us to carry. This mentality also perpetuates guilt. If we can't solve everything on our own, we may feel that God is disappointed with us. But the Bible offers a different message, a message of grace, mercy, and divine help. God helps those who are willing to acknowledge their need for Him, not those who are strong enough to carry their burdens alone. When we examine the teachings of Jesus, we find a completely different message than the one presented by the phrase, God helps those who help themselves. Jesus never told us that God only helps those who are self-sufficient. In fact, He taught the exact opposite. God's help is available to those who are humble, broken, and willing to surrender. Let's look at one of the most powerful invitations Jesus gives in Matthew 11:28-30. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. In this passage, Jesus doesn't say, come to me, all you who are strong, independent, and capable, and I will help you. No, He invites those who are weary, burdened, and broken, those who are struggling, those who are at the end of their rope. Jesus didn't call for self-sufficiency. He called for humility and dependence. He invites us to bring our burdens to Him, not because we can't help ourselves, but because He is the one who can carry our burdens for us. We see the same principle in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke 18:9-14. The Pharisee, proud of his religious efforts and self-righteousness, stood before God thanking Him that he was not like other sinners. On the other hand, the tax collector, fully aware of his shortcomings, stood at a distance, humbled, and prayed, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Jesus said that it was the tax collector, not the Pharisee, who went home justified before God. The message is clear. God helps the humble, those who recognize their need for His grace. Jesus also gave us the Beatitudes in Matthew 5, where He describes the kind of people who are blessed in the kingdom of God. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Notice that none of these blessings go to those who are self-reliant or self-sufficient. They go to those who are broken, humble, and in need of God's help. This is a radical departure from the God helps those who help themselves mentality. The kingdom of God belongs to the humble, not the self-sufficient. When Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened," he was not just offering a message for the physically tired. He was offering hope to those spiritually exhausted, to those who feel like they've tried everything on their own and have come up short. His help is not reserved for the capable, but for those who acknowledge their inability and surrender to his grace. Jesus didn't come to empower the already empowered. He came to lift up the brokenhearted, the helpless, and the humble. Grace is the heart of the gospel message. It is undeserved, unearned, and unconditional. Yet, when we buy into the idea that God helps those who help themselves, we overlook the essence of grace. This false thinking suggests that God's help comes only to those who first make an effort to fix themselves, their circumstances, or their struggles. But grace has no such conditions. It does not ask you to become worthy before God will intervene in your life. God's grace is not about what you can do. It's about what he has already done for you. Consider for a moment the story of the prodigal son in Luke 15:11 through 32. The son who had squandered his inheritance on reckless living found himself in the depths of poverty, broken and ashamed. He had nothing left. In his mind, he was no longer worthy to be called his father's son. Yet when he returned to his father in a desperate state, he did not find rejection. Instead, he found grace. His father ran to him, embraced him, and restored him. The son did not help himself first. In fact, he was completely powerless to fix his situation. But his father's love and grace were greater than his mistakes, his weaknesses, and his failures. Grace doesn't wait for us to get it right. It doesn't look at our effort first, it looks at our hearts. The grace of God meets us exactly where we are, broken, defeated, and weak. It doesn't matter if we've messed up, if we've been running away, or if we've tried and failed. God's grace is what makes the difference, not our own strength or ability to help ourselves. When we attempt to rely on our own efforts, we risk missing the gift that is already available to us. Grace invites us to stop striving and start trusting. In the book of 2 Corinthians 12:9, Paul shares a powerful revelation from God. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." Paul didn't rely on his own strength to overcome the challenges he faced. Instead, he relied on the sufficiency of God's grace. This is the truth that is at the very core of the gospel. God's power is made perfect, not in our strength, but in our weakness. The more we try to stand on our own, the more we distance ourselves from the very help God is eager to offer. But the more we humble ourselves and acknowledge our dependence on his grace, the more we experience the fullness of his power in our lives. Grace is not just about salvation. It's about every moment of our lives, whether we are facing personal challenges, struggling with relationships, or fighting battles that seem too big to win. God's grace is sufficient. And that grace is not something we earn or achieve. It is a gift. This is the truth we must remember. God helps those who admit their need for him, not those who believe they can do it all on their own. Look at the example of Peter walking on water in Matthew 14:22 through 33.3. Peter, filled with faith, stepped out of the boat and began walking toward Jesus. But as he saw the wind and waves, fear gripped him and he began to sink. In that moment of weakness and fear, Peter didn't say, "I can do this myself. I can save myself." No, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out and pulled him up. Peter didn't help himself first. He called out for help. And Jesus responded with grace. God's help is not contingent on our ability to get everything right first. It's available when we acknowledge our need for him. Grace is the antidote to the myth of self-reliance. It is the divine response to our brokenness. Instead of striving harder to fix ourselves, we are invited to receive, to trust in the sufficiency of God's love and mercy. When we rely on grace, we stop living in guilt and shame for not being good enough. We stop thinking that God is waiting for us to earn His favor before He will intervene. Grace tells us that God's help is not based on our performance, but on His love. Now let's shift our focus to another critical aspect of the Christian life, faith. The phrase, God helps those who help themselves, suggests that we must first take action, then God will meet us halfway. But Jesus presents an entirely different picture. He calls us to faith, to believe that God's help is available to us, not because of what we can do for ourselves, but because of what He has already done for us. Faith is not about our ability to accomplish great things on our own. Faith is about trusting in God's ability to work in our lives, even when we feel weak, broken, or incapable. Faith doesn't require us to have all the answers or to figure everything out. It requires us to step out in trust and believe that God is with us in every situation. In the book of Hebrews 11, often referred to as the Faith Hall of Fame, we find examples of people who overcame impossible circumstances, not because of their own strength or abilities, but because they had faith in God's promises. Abraham left everything behind, not knowing where he was going, but trusting that God had a plan. Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, not because he had the power to part the Red Sea, but because he believed that God would deliver them. These heroes of faith didn't rely on their own strength. They relied on God's strength. In Matthew 17:20, Jesus tells His disciples, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Jesus didn't say, if you work hard enough, you can move mountains. He didn't say, if you help yourself first, then I'll help you. No, He said that faith, even the tiniest amount, has the power to move mountains. Faith is not about what you can do. It's about what God can do through you when you trust in His power. Think about the centurion's servant in Matthew 8:05 and 13. The centurion, a Roman officer, came to Jesus asking for healing for his servant. Really, he didn't need Jesus to physically go to his house. Instead, he simply said, say the word and my servant will be healed. Jesus was amazed by his faith and healed the servant without even being present. Faith in God's ability to work in our lives is what unlocks His power. It's not about us helping ourselves first. It's about believing that God can do what we cannot. Faith is the foundation of God's help in our lives. It's not about how much we can do, but how much we trust in what God can do. The Apostle Paul captures this beautifully in Ephesians 3:20. Now to Him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to His power that is at work within us. This power doesn't come from our own abilities. It comes from faith in God. A faith that believes, despite our weaknesses, that He can do the impossible in our lives. Faith allows us to let go of self-reliance and trust God's perfect plan, even when we don't understand it. When we place our faith in Him, we open the door for His help, His power, and His grace to work in and through us. Faith invites God into the impossible, and it's through faith that we experience the reality of His intervention in our lives. The false belief that God helps those who help themselves distorts the essence of the gospel and misrepresents the heart of God. It tells us that our worthiness of God's assistance depends on how capable we are to stand on our own, when in reality God's help is available not because of what we can do, but because of His infinite grace. The truth is that God delights in helping the weak, the broken, and the humble, not those who think they can handle everything by themselves. We have seen that Jesus never preached self-reliance, but instead called us to faith, humility, and dependence on God's grace. He came to show us that the kingdom of God is for those who acknowledge their need, not for those who strive to be self-sufficient. His invitation is clear. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. This is not a call for those who have everything figured out. It's a call for those who are ready to surrender their efforts, their control, and their pride to receive his help. When we step away from the myth of self-reliance and embrace faith in God's power, we open ourselves to the abundance of his grace. It is in our weakness that his power is made perfect, and it is through faith that we experience the miraculous and life-changing help of God. As we stop trying to prove ourselves worthy of his assistance and instead lean into his grace, we discover that his help is never far from us, no matter how difficult or overwhelming life may seem. So let us cast aside the burden of thinking we must do it all ourselves. Let us embrace the truth that God's grace is sufficient for every trial, every obstacle, and every moment of weakness. Let us walk in faith, knowing that God helps those who humble themselves before him, not those who think they can help themselves. The help of God is not a reward for effort. It is a gift to those who trust in his ability to make all things possible. May we all come to a place where we stop striving for self-sufficiency and begin living in the freedom that comes from resting in the grace and power of God.